HOA Karen slaps teen for parking in visitor spot. I don't like your kind here. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when Marcus, a 16-year-old high school student, decided to visit his friend, Tyrell, who lived in the suburban community on the outskirts of town. Marcus had been to Tyrell's house several times before, but this time, he was feeling especially excited. They had planned to hang out, play video games, and catch up on the latest basketball game that had taken place the previous night. It wasn't a big deal to him, it was just a typical visit between friends. He drove his father's car, a used sedan that had seen better days but still got him from point A to point B without issue. The drive over was uneventful, and Marcus arrived at Tyrell's townhouse just after 2 p.m. The community was the kind that was meticulously maintained, green lawns, flower beds neatly arranged, and homes that all looked the same. The streets were quiet, but the parking lot at the end of the cul-de-sac had an air of exclusivity. It was reserved for residents and their guests, and the visitor spots were clearly marked. Marcus knew that as long as he parked in one of those spaces, he wouldn't be in anyone's way. He pulled into the first available visitor spot, locked the car, and walked towards Tyrell's front door, eagerly anticipating their hangout session. The peaceful atmosphere of the neighborhood soon shattered when Marcus heard footsteps behind him. He turned around to see a woman, likely in her late 40s, striding towards him with a look of clear disapproval on her face. Her stiff posture and stern expression made it clear that she wasn't someone who tolerated much. Marcus immediately recognized her as Karen, a name he had heard from Tyrell and other residents in the neighborhood. Karen was notorious for keeping an eye on who came and went, especially when it came to visitors. She prided herself on maintaining a sense of control over the community and had often voiced her opinions on what she considered appropriate behavior. "Excuse me," Karen called out, her tone sharp and commanding as she approached him. Marcus, caught off guard by her sudden presence, stopped in his tracks and turned to face her. He gave her a polite nod, unsure of what to expect. "Yes?" Marcus responded, unsure if this was just a random encounter or if there was something more to it. "You're parked in a visitor spot," Karen began, her voice laced with an air of superiority. "That's for guests of the residence." "Are you a guest?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as if she were scrutinizing him in a way that made him uncomfortable. Marcus, still trying to figure out what the issue was, responded politely, "Yeah, I'm here visiting my friend, Tyrell. I'm just here to hang out for a bit." Karen's gaze seemed to harden at the mention of Tyrell's name, and Marcus could feel the shift in the air. He didn't understand why, but something about the interaction felt wrong. The woman looked at him as if she didn't believe him or perhaps didn't want to believe him. "That doesn't give you the right to park here," she said, her voice a little colder now. "You people don't belong here." Marcus froze for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of her words, her tone dripping with disdain, and it took him a few seconds to process what she had just said. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. Karen's expression turned sour. She stepped closer, crossing the small gap between them, and lowered her voice in a way that made the situation all the more menacing. "You know exactly what I mean. We don't need your kind in this neighborhood," she spat, her words hanging in the air like a sharp, painful sting. Marcus' chest tightened as he heard her words. His heart began to race, and his thoughts started to spin. He had heard stories of racist behavior, of prejudice and discrimination, but he had never imagined he would experience it firsthand in such a blatant way. His hand instinctively reached for his phone in his pocket, but before he could react further, Karen's next words sent him into a state of shock. "You need to move your car right now," Karen ordered, her voice now almost a sneer. "You're not welcome here, and you don't belong parking in a spot designated for people who actually live here." Marcus stood still, a mix of disbelief and anger swelling in his chest. He was trying to process the situation and decide how to respond, but before he could speak, Karen's hand flew up, and she slapped his arm, hard. The force of the slap made Marcus flinch, and for a split second, he couldn't believe what had just happened. His mind was reeling, and he instinctively rubbed his arm where she had struck him, the sting of the impact lingering. "Don't touch me!" Marcus shouted, stepping back, his face flushed with a mix of shock and rage. He was taken aback by her boldness and her audacity to physically strike him over something so trivial. Karen, however, didn't back down. She simply stood there, watching him, an air of satisfaction in her gaze as if she had somehow won the confrontation. "You don't have the right to be here, and you certainly don't have the right to talk back to me," she sneered. "I suggest you move your car and get out of this neighborhood. Now." The anger within Marcus boiled over. He wasn't going to let this woman push him around, not like this, not in this way. The slap, her words, her entire demeanor, it was all too much. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, before responding. "You can't just go around hitting people. And I'm not moving my car. I've done nothing wrong. You're the one who needs to leave." Karen scoffed, brushing him off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You don't belong here, and neither does your car. Now, move it before I call the authorities and have you removed." Marcus knew he was at a crossroads. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he didn't want to escalate things any further. He had never been one to back down from injustice, but something about the way Karen stood there, so convinced of her own authority, made him hesitate. He wasn't sure if it was worth getting into a confrontation with someone like her. Still, he had to stand his ground. Instead of arguing further, he turned and made his way toward Tyrell's front door. He wasn't going to let Karen's ignorant and hateful actions ruin his day, but he also wasn't going to let her get away with what she had just done. As he reached for the doorbell, he felt a knot in his stomach. He wasn't sure what kind of neighborhood this was, but he was beginning to feel more and more unwelcome. Tyrell answered the door a moment later, a concerned look crossing his face when he saw the tension in Marcus's eyes. "What happened?" "You look upset," Tyrell asked, noticing the flushed look on Marcus' face. Marcus didn't say anything right away. He just shook his head, his mind still trying to process everything. "I'll tell you inside," he said quietly, stepping past his friend and into the house. As the door closed behind him, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. He didn't know what to do about Karen, or about the situation in the neighborhood, but he knew one thing for certain: things needed to change. He wasn't going to let people like her continue to spread hate without standing up for himself. He wasn't going to let racism be normalized, not today, not ever again. The encounter with Karen left Marcus shaken, but he tried not to let it ruin his visit with Tyrell. As he stepped inside Tyrell's house, the weight of the interaction outside began to sink in. Tyrell, noticing the tense expression on Marcus's face, closed the door behind him and walked over. "Dude, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice filled with concern. Marcus paused, trying to figure out how to put what had just happened into words. He had never been confronted like that before, certainly not in such a personal and hurtful way. It wasn't just the racist remarks or the slap, it was the sheer audacity of it all, the way Karen had felt entitled to treat him like that, as if he didn't belong in the same space as the other people who lived in that neighborhood. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before speaking. She slapped me, man," Marcus said finally, his voice still heavy with disbelief. "She literally slapped my arm when I wouldn't move my car. And she kept saying stuff about me not belonging here. She said I wasn't welcome in the neighborhood, that my kind doesn't belong here." Tyrell's eyes widened, and his face tightened with anger. He was silent for a moment, clearly processing what his friend had just shared. "What the hell? That's messed up, bro," Tyrell muttered, his voice low. "She's done stuff like that before, but nothing like this. I can't believe she hit you." Marcus nodded, feeling the sting of the slap still on his arm, though it was more the emotional impact that lingered in his chest. "I mean, I get that people can be rude or whatever, but this was next level. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Just straight up telling me I didn't belong and then slapping me, like I was supposed to just take it." He rubbed his arm absent-mindedly, still feeling the phantom pain from the slap. Tyrell was pacing now, clearly upset, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Man, I hate how people like her think they can just get away with it. Like they're the only ones who matter. You should have called the cops, at least filed a report or something. I thought about it, Marcus said, sitting down on the couch. But honestly, I wasn't sure it was even worth it. I mean, she's a member of the HOA. She probably has the whole neighborhood on her side, you know? I don't even know where to begin. I wasn't trying to make a scene or anything, I just wanted to hang out with you. But she made it personal, and now I'm feeling like this whole place is just not for me. Tyrell sat next to Marcus, his face still etched with frustration. That's the problem with people like her. They make it feel like it's not your place to be, like you're just supposed to stay in your lane. But she's wrong, bro. She doesn't get to decide who belongs here or not. You belong just as much as anyone else. Hell, more than people like her. Marcus sighed, leaning back into the couch. I don't even know if I want to deal with this. I don't want to be the guy who's always making a fuss, you know? But I can't just ignore it either. I keep thinking about it. What if I hadn't stood my ground? What if I had just moved the car? What does that say about me? You're not the one who needs to move, bro. She's the one out of line. Don't let her win, Tyrell said, his voice firm. You shouldn't have to feel like you're not welcome anywhere. It's not fair. Marcus nodded slowly, grateful for Tyrell's support but still feeling conflicted. I'm just tired of this kind of stuff, man. It's like every time I think things are getting better, something like this happens to remind me of how far we still have to go. He paused, glancing over at his friend. You ever feel like you're just going through the motions? Like, you know the world's not really all that welcoming, but you keep trying anyway, and it's like no matter what, you'll always be fighting for the same basic stuff. Tyrell looked at Marcus for a long moment, the expression on his face thoughtful. Yeah, I feel you. It's like we're stuck in this loop, trying to be ourselves, trying to live our lives, and every time we take a step forward, someone like Karen comes along and knocks us 2 steps back. It's exhausting, but we can't let them stop us. We can't let people like her dictate how we live our lives. Marcus sat in silence for a few moments, letting the weight of Tyrell's words sink in. It was true. They couldn't let people like Karen define their worth or their place in the world. They were not the problem, even if people like her treated them that way. A few minutes later, the conversation shifted to their plans for the rest of the day. They talked about video games, basketball, and other typical teenage topics, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. It was like Karen's words and actions had taken root in his mind, and no matter how much he tried to push them aside, they kept resurfacing. The rest of the day was spent trying to push those feelings into the background, but they lingered like an unwanted shadow. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, the events from earlier kept replaying in his mind. He couldn't sleep, his thoughts racing. What would his parents say if they knew what had happened? What if things had escalated further, if he had reacted differently, if he had pushed back harder? Would it have made a difference? He knew that the slap had been a symbol of something much larger than a single incident. It was part of a larger pattern of prejudice and racism that he had been navigating his entire life, and he was tired. He was tired of constantly having to fight for his right to exist in spaces that should be his to claim. But then he thought about Tyrell, about the way he had stood by him, offering comfort and support. He thought about the other people in his life who had always had his back, who reminded him that he was worth something. Those were the people who mattered, not Karen or anyone like her. And in that moment, Marcus made a silent vow to himself, he would no longer let people like Karen take anything from him. He was strong, he was capable, and he belonged wherever he chose to be. The next day, Marcus woke up with a new resolve. He knew he couldn't just let this go, but he also knew he didn't want to stoop to Karen's level. There were ways to fight back without sinking into anger and bitterness. He was going to stand up for himself, but in a way that showed his strength, not his frustration. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road he wasn't going to walk alone. With that, Marcus made a decision. He was going to talk to Tyrell's parents about the incident. He was going to make sure someone knew what had happened and take the first step toward making things right, not just for himself, but for everyone who might face the same kind of injustice in that neighborhood. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right thing to do. And for the first time since Karen had slapped him, Marcus felt a sense of empowerment rising within him. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready to face it head-on. The following days after Marcus's decision to confront the situation with Karen were a blur of conflicting emotions, but deep down, he knew he had made the right choice. He spent the next morning texting Tyrell, telling him that they needed to talk about what had happened. Tyrell had been supportive, offering words of comfort, but Marcus still felt unsettled. He couldn't ignore the anger that boiled inside of him every time he thought about the slap, about the way Karen had treated him simply because of who he was. Still, he knew that he couldn't let this simmer forever. He had to take action. He had to make sure that what had happened didn't just fade into the background. He had to stand up not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated like that. Later that afternoon, Marcus arrived at Tyrell's house, his nerves on edge as he approached the door. He took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell, trying to calm himself. Tyrell opened the door quickly, his expression immediately softening when he saw the look on Marcus's face. "Hey, man, you okay?" Tyrell asked, stepping aside to let Marcus in. "I don't know," Marcus admitted as he stepped inside. I think I am, but I also feel, I don't know, like there's something I need to do about it. I can't just let it go. I want to talk to your parents." Tyrell's eyebrows furrowed, clearly surprised by the request. "You want to talk to my parents? About Karen?" "Yeah," Marcus said, looking down at his shoes for a moment before meeting Tyrell's gaze. "I just feel like I can't let this slide. I don't want to be that guy who doesn't do anything. If I let her get away with it, then, I don't know, I'll just feel like I'm letting everyone who's ever faced that kind of shit down." Tyrell nodded slowly, taking a moment to think. "You know, my parents aren't really the type to get involved in stuff like this. But if it's really bothering you, man, then we'll do whatever we need to. You know I've got your back." Marcus smiled faintly at his friend's words. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate Tyrell's support, it was just that this wasn't something he wanted to brush off. He wanted to take a stand, to make sure that Karen's actions were addressed in a way that would hold her accountable. He wasn't sure what exactly would come of talking to Tyrell's parents, but he knew it was better than sitting around and letting it fester. The two of them sat on the couch in the living room, waiting for Tyrell's parents to return from a quick errand. It felt like time was moving too slowly, and Marcus found himself replaying every moment of his interaction with Karen in his head. He thought about the way she had walked up to him with that condescending attitude, the way she had dismissed him before even giving him a chance to explain. The more he thought about it, the more the anger resurfaced, and he had to remind himself that this wasn't about getting revenge or making her feel bad, it was about making sure that her behavior didn't go unnoticed. When Tyrell's parents finally arrived home, they greeted Marcus warmly, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Marcus had been to Tyrell's house plenty of times, but today felt different. He knew they could tell something was wrong, that the normal energy in the room was now tainted by the weight of what had happened. After a few minutes of small talk, Marcus cleared his throat, trying to find the right words to begin the conversation. He wasn't sure how Tyrell's parents would react, but he knew that if he was going to talk to them about this, he had to be honest. "I wanted to talk to you guys about something that happened to me yesterday," Marcus began, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. Tyrell's mom, a kind woman with a warm smile, looked at him curiously. "What happened, Marcus?" she asked, sitting down next to him. Tyrell's dad, a tall man with a calm demeanor, took a seat across from them, his attention fully focused on Marcus. "It's about something that happened in the parking lot outside," Marcus said, trying to keep his tone as even as possible. "I parked in the visitor spot, like I've done before when I come here. But this lady, Karen, I don't know if you've met her, she came up to me, and she said I wasn't allowed to park there because of who I am. She called me some pretty racist things, and then, when I wouldn't move my car, she slapped me." There was a heavy silence in the room as Marcus finished speaking. Tyrell's parents exchanged looks, their faces a mix of disbelief and concern. His mom was the first to speak, her voice quiet but filled with empathy. "Marcus, I'm so sorry that happened to you. No one should ever treat you like that. I can't believe she physically assaulted you like that, especially in a neighborhood that should be welcoming." Tyrell's dad nodded, his expression serious. "That's unacceptable. It's not just about the parking spot. It's about the fact that she felt she had the right to do that to you, that somehow you weren't worthy of being here, of having the same respect as anyone else. And that's not something we can just ignore." Marcus felt a mix of relief and frustration. He had been afraid that they might downplay it, that they might try to dismiss it as just a one-time incident. But Tyrell's parents didn't do that. Instead, they acknowledged the hurt he felt and validated his experience. It made him feel a little lighter, as though he wasn't the only one carrying the weight of what had happened. "We're going to do something about this," Tyrell's dad said, standing up. "You're not the first person she's targeted, and you won't be the last unless someone stands up to her. We'll take this to the HOA. I don't care if she's on their board, what she did is wrong, and it needs to be addressed." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Tyrell's parents to take action like that. They weren't just offering words of sympathy, they were willing to stand with him, to confront the problem head-on. It gave him a sense of power that he hadn't felt before, the realization that maybe, just maybe, this would not go unnoticed. They would make sure Karen was held accountable for her actions. "We'll back you up in whatever way we can, Marcus," Tyrell's mom added, giving him a reassuring smile. "No one should ever make you feel like you don't belong, especially in a community that's supposed to be inclusive." The weight on Marcus's shoulders seemed to lift as he listened to their words. For the first time since the incident, he felt like things were actually going to change. He wasn't alone in this fight. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about getting revenge on Karen, it was about showing everyone in the community that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. That standing up for yourself was the only way to make sure others didn't have to go through the same thing. Later that evening, Marcus left Tyrell's house feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. Tyrell's parents had offered more than just support, they had given him the courage to keep going, to make sure Karen's actions didn't fade into the background. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. And maybe, just maybe, his small act of resistance would inspire others to speak up too. This wasn't over yet, but Marcus felt ready for whatever came next. The days that followed the conversation with Tyrell's parents were filled with a quiet, steady determination. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation slowly shifting in his favor, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. There was still Karen to deal with, and the HOA, which was bound to get involved, would likely present a whole new set of challenges. But the support from Tyrell's family had given him a newfound sense of strength. He wasn't in this fight alone, and that meant everything to him. As much as he had tried to ignore it before, the reality of being a black teenager in a predominantly white neighborhood had never been more apparent than it was now. But even so, Marcus wasn't going to let that stop him. He knew that silence and inaction would only let people like Karen win, and he wasn't about to let her, or anyone else, define who he was or where he belonged. On the morning of the HOA meeting, Marcus woke up with a sense of purpose. His stomach churned with nerves, but he pushed the feeling aside, reminding himself that this was bigger than just his own discomfort. This was about standing up for himself, standing up for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of their race, because of their background. He had been through a lot in his life, but today, he was going to make sure that Karen and anyone else who shared her mindset knew that their actions wouldn't go unnoticed. As he got dressed, his mind raced through the events of the past few days. He thought about how Karen had slapped him, about the anger and frustration that had overwhelmed him. But today, it wasn't about anger, it was about justice. And more than that, it was about setting a precedent, about showing that people like Karen couldn't simply act with impunity and expect no consequences. Tyrell had offered to accompany him to the HOA meeting, but Marcus had declined. He knew that his friend would have his back, but he also felt that it was important for him to stand alone in this moment. It wasn't about needing someone else to fight his battles for him, it was about asserting his own power and voice. He had to face this challenge on his own, even if it was uncomfortable. He wanted the people in that room to see him, to hear his story, and to know that he wasn't afraid. As Marcus arrived at the HOA office, he took a deep breath before stepping inside. The building was sleek and modern, designed to give off the appearance of professionalism and order. But as he walked through the door and into the small waiting area, he felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the cold, sterile environment only served to amplify his nerves. The receptionist, a woman with a polite smile, greeted him as he approached the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone neutral but cordial. "I'm here for the HOA meeting," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to speak about an incident that happened in the neighborhood." The receptionist nodded and gestured to a seat. "The meeting will begin shortly. Please take a seat, and someone will come to escort you when it's your turn." Marcus sat down, his hands slightly trembling in his lap. He tried to push the nervousness away, focusing instead on the resolve that had gotten him this far. He had no idea how the meeting would unfold, but he was ready. As the minutes passed, he looked around the waiting area, noticing the other people who had come to attend the meeting. They were mostly middle-aged, with a few older residents thrown in, all dressed in a way that suggested they took their roles in the community seriously. He wondered if they knew what they were about to hear. Would they support him, or would they side with Karen? Eventually, a man in his 50s, dressed in a suit, came out of one of the doors and introduced himself as the HOA president. He had a calm, measured voice, and his handshake was firm as he led Marcus into the meeting room. The room was sleek and modern, with a long conference table surrounded by chairs. A few other people were already seated, their faces neutral as they glanced up at Marcus as he entered the room. Karen was sitting at the far end of the table, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her face set in an expression of defiance. She barely acknowledged Marcus as he took his seat. "Thank you for coming today, Marcus," the HOA president said as he sat at the head of the table. "We're here to discuss the incident that took place in the parking lot last week, and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us." Marcus nodded, but his gaze didn't waver from Karen. The president continued, outlining the agenda for the meeting and asking Marcus to begin by describing what had happened. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady as he spoke, recounting the events of that afternoon in the parking lot. He told them how Karen had approached him, how she had insulted him with racist remarks, and how, when he refused to move his car, she slapped him. As he spoke, he saw Karen's face redden with anger, but he refused to look away. This was his moment. This was his chance to make sure his voice was heard. When he finished, the room fell silent. Karen's eyes were narrowed, her jaw clenched, but she didn't speak. The HOA president turned to her, asking for her side of the story. Karen immediately launched into a defense, claiming that she had only acted out of concern for the community's values. She said that Marcus had parked in a spot that was reserved for residents and their guests, and that she was simply trying to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. She didn't acknowledge the racist comments or the slap. Instead, she doubled down on her position, insisting that her actions had been justified. As Karen spoke, Marcus could feel the anger rising in his chest again. It was as if she was trying to twist the narrative, to make herself out to be the victim. But he knew better. He wasn't going to let her get away with that. When the HOA president turned to him and asked if he had anything to say in response, Marcus took a deep breath and stood up. "I'm not here to argue about parking spots," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here because I was disrespected, I was attacked, and I was made to feel like I didn't belong. What Karen did wasn't just about parking, it was about trying to make me feel less than, about telling me that I don't deserve to be here, that I don't belong. And that's something I can't just ignore. I know what racism looks like, and I know that Karen's behavior wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about her trying to assert power over me in a way that was meant to make me feel small. And I won't let that stand." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he stood tall, unwavering in his conviction. Finally, the HOA president spoke, his voice slow and measured. "I think we've heard enough," he said, looking between Marcus and Karen. We will take some time to deliberate on the matter and decide what action, if any, will be taken. Thank you both for your time. As the meeting ended, Marcus felt a sense of closure, though the outcome was still uncertain. He had spoken his truth, and he had done so in a way that demanded respect. The HOA would have to decide what to do, but Marcus knew that his actions had already made an impact. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had set a precedent, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. He had shown that silence and complacency weren't options. No one should ever have to endure what he had, and no one would again if he had anything to say about it. Walking out of the meeting room, Marcus felt lighter than he had in days. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer just a passive bystander in his own story. He was an active participant, and he was ready for whatever came next.